Good morning. This is Pleasant Valley Baptist Church, Two Rivers, Alaska. This happens to be the 7th day of November. I'm approaching my 77th birthday this week. So I thank the Lord for his goodness to us, and thank the Lord for this congregation. This week is also a birthday of one of the ladies that listens to us. She's been up here, spent time with us. We appreciate Mary Hawley, and I hope when you hear this on, I don't know, I think you hear it on Facebook, or you can hear it on YouTube, and happy birthday, Mary. The Lord bless you. In Acts chapter 25, we are continuing the saga of Paul being taken prisoner. The captain of the host in Jerusalem saw a mob going on in the temple area. He sends his soldiers down, and he rescues Paul from being literally tore limb for limb. He takes the man, Paul the apostle, and puts him in safekeeping in the fortress of Antonia, and he keeps him there. They have a trial, and it ends in an uproar and so forth. And so the chief captain of the Roman army there once again takes him out and is keeping him safe in the castle. While he's there, Paul's nephew, a young man in Jerusalem, learns that there is a assassination attempt that's going to take place on Paul's life. Paul sends his nephew to the captain, and the captain listens to it. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the army of 472 men escorting Paul from Jerusalem to the city of Caesarea. Now, Jerusalem is on the high ridge in Palestine. Caesarea is on the sea. Caesarea was built by King Herod before the time of Christ. He sunk large rocks, and he did some very interesting construction. He put concrete forms that he had made out of great big wooden timbers and sunk them into the bay and filled them with concrete under salt water. Of course, the timbers have rotted away in the 2,000 years since then, but the concrete is left, and the form and the print of the grain and so forth of the wood that he had used for forms is still on the concrete. The concrete is still there. If you go scuba diving or diving in Caesarea Bay, you get to see the water break that he put in. You get to see the harbor that he built. The harbor is open to the north. The break and so forth is on the south and west side of the land, because the wind blows from Egypt towards the north. Now, they got Paul to the city of Caesarea. Felix was the chief man of the Roman army, and he's displayed with Paul. And finally, last week, Paul speaks before Felix, and he really preaches. And he has Felix and Drusilla in an audience, and he preaches a great sermon. And at the end of the sermon, Felix says, "Almost, Paul, thou hast persuaded me to become a Christian." And that's where we left it. You see, Felix was really a corrupt man. He wasn't a true man, if you please. He was politically motivated. He did full well what he wanted to do. He wanted to take money. He wanted Paul to bribe him, and Paul wouldn't bribe him. I don't know if Paul was out of money or what, but he chose not to do it, and he's in jail. Felix left him in jail for 2 years. In the meantime, Rome had found out that Felix was such a rat and was doing such bad things, they decided to recall him after he had instigated a disturbance between the Gentiles, the Greeks, and the Jews. And he turned the soldiers loose on the Jews, and he killed thousands of Jews right there in the streets of Caesarea. Rome wanted peace. Remember, we talked about that last week? So they pull Felix out, and they're sending a young man here by the name of Festus. Now, when I think of Festus, I think of, was it Gunsmoke that Festus was on? Now, Festus on Gunsmoke was kind of bumbling, wasn't he? This Festus was the exact opposite. This man was very disciplined and very precise. And this is where we pick it up in chapter 25, verse 1. Now, when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. He had got to his post for the military in Caesarea, and within 3 days of landing there, he doesn't party, he doesn't spend a bunch of time there. He says, I'm intent on keeping peace with the Jewish people. And he went immediately to the religious capital, Jerusalem. Caesarea is the political capital, okay, or the army outpost, if you please. And it's going to be very, very full of action. Verse 2, then the high priest and chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. Now, there's also been another change politically. There's going to be a new king over this whole area, King Agrippa II. And he is going to be in charge of the treasury at the temple, and Agrippa II is going to be in charge of the high priest. He picked the high priest. Now, we believe in separation of church and state, right? Well, the Romans were picking the head chief priest for the Jewish people. So this chief priest that has been picked and is in Jerusalem now has been handpicked by a Roman king, King Agrippa. As soon as Festus gets to Jerusalem, the Jews corner him and say, hey, we have a rascal by the name of Paul that is really causing us trouble. Now, what's he doing? Well, he's trying to win Festus over, and what he really wants to do, the high priest and the Sanhedrin, is kill him. To pure out. Notice verse 3. It says, and the high priest desired favor. He didn't desire trust. He didn't desire truth. He didn't desire any of these other things. He wanted a favor. He didn't want justice. They wanted Paul killed. And he desires a favor against him, that he would send him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. Now, who's writing this? Who's doing the record here? Luke writes the book of Acts, just like he wrote the book of Gospel of Luke. He wrote the book of Acts. And he said the purpose they wanted to bring Paul back from Caesarea to Jerusalem and try him in Jerusalem was that they would assassinate him on the way. They wouldn't have to have the trial. They've had several trials, and they've come out short every time. We know little about Festus from history, but we know that he was a Roman procurator of Judea from 58 AD to 62. He desired to rule Israel properly and well, and he knew that the nature of the Jews was very volatile. In other words, they were at a boiling point. Now, if this is 58 AD, in 70, in 12 years, Titus is going to march on Jerusalem and utterly destroy it, burn it to the ground, kill the Jews, and scatter them to the four corners of the earth. That's where we have Jews even here in America today. The Romans had their fill of Jerusalem. But this was 58 AD, and he was trying to make things go right. A heavy item that Festus has to pick up now is this unfinished business of Felix. Felix wouldn't do anything with Paul. He just let him sit in jail. He didn't bring a judgment against him or anything. He just kind of let it hang out there. And of course, Felix was taken away. And by the way, Felix died in an ignoramus. He was very well, I'd say is cursed. Now they're asking Festus to be their partner. But I want you to notice in verse 4, but Festus answered. Had they influenced Festus to follow with them? No. It says Festus answered that Paul should be kept in Caesarea, that he himself would depart shortly thither. So he's saying here, you have a very weak case, and you're asking me a favor to spend the time and the troops to bring Paul back down here? He said, I'm not going to do it. He said, this is not a religious court. This is a civil matter, and you want capital punishment. He says, you're going to take care of it in the capital city. You're coming to Caesarea. Now, does that sound like a man of real valor? Yes, it sounds like a man of a true heart. This between you and me, I like Festus a whole lot more than I like Felix. Felix was a rat. But Festus is trying to do things right. You see, for 2 years, they didn't have Paul there. But does the evil ever die easy? No. Evil always dies very hard. Point number 2, I want us to remember, this is kind of like a footnote. It's pretty hard to kill somebody that God wants to live. God had said, Paul, you're going to preach for me in Rome. You're going to preach to Nero. And, you know, the designs of the Jewish people are going to come to naught, isn't it? So they had made a design against God. As Festus looks at this, God allows Festus to see the hearts of these evil people. He can see their motive and their deception. He says, if you want a trial, you come to Caesarea. Verse 5, let them therefore, said he, which is among you are able, in other words, the knowledgeable ones in this case, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. I believe that Festus has done some homework on this case, and he's dug into it, and I believe he's talked with the captain of the Jewish soldiers there in Jerusalem, and Lysias had told them, I don't see anything wrong with this man. He's not worthy or guilty of death. And he uses the little phrase, if there's any wickedness in him. Verse 6, and when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, or about 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. Now, do you see a man here that was being lazy about his job? No. He was trying to deal with this thing in a very judicial way. But what's going to happen, we're going to have the same court scene that we saw with Felix. It says here, and when he was come in verse 7, that he called Paul, in verse 7, and when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid, notice the words here of Luke, many and grievous complaints against Paul, comma, which they could not prove. He said it's just like before. They come in, and there's a lot of preachers, when the point gets pretty weak and they're having a hard time proving it, they start screaming. They start hollering. And these people were doing that very thing. They was many and severe. There's going to be 3 charges basically brought against Paul here. The first one will be about the law of the Jewish religion. So the first, when we read here, the first charge will be he's against the Jews, and then he's going to say, he brought a Gentile into our temple, and they call that sacrilege. And thirdly, what Paul is doing is against Rome, and they call that treason. So we have 3 charges here that would be against the law, sacrilege, and treason. So they laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Verse 8, while he answered for himself. Now you notice they didn't bring a lawyer this time, Tertullus, like they did last time. This time they're just kind of like mad dogs ravaging and just screaming and yelling. When Paul answered, neither against the law of the Jews, point 1, neither against the temple, point 2, nor against Caesar, treason, have I offended anything at all. Now, I like the way Paul briefly, categorically goes to the heart of the matter and says there's no truth to it. He denies it. They haven't proved anything, and under Roman law, as under our law, which our law was drafted after, you have to prove that he's guilty. And they haven't brought any proof. There wasn't anybody there that said, well, I saw Paul bring a man into the temple and pollute the temple. I haven't seen one thing that Paul really did that was against Rome. I haven't seen Paul do one thing really against the Jews. No person was willing to come to the trial and said, as a witness, and say, I saw Paul break the law. Even in our government, you have to have witnesses. Even under the Old Testament law, in the mouth of 2 or 3 people, it has to be established. So Paul says, I haven't done any of this. Now, remember, Festus was trying to keep the peace with the Jews, right? He didn't want this thing to boil over right here at the beginning. Verse 9, but Festus, willing to the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of those things before me? Festus says, will you go to Jerusalem? Are you going to go down there? And would you do that? And what he's saying is this a religious question? Or is this a civil question? And Paul is going to be very, very emphatic. Verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. Now, when it says Caesar, that is not a person, that is an office. For example, if I would say, I apply to the president, I'm applying to an office, right? If I say I apply to, or I'm appealing my case to Biden, I'm doing it to a man. So when we read through this chapter, when he reads Augustus or Caesar, he's talking about an office. That office at this time happens to be held by Nero. Have you ever heard of Nero? He's the joker that fiddled while Rome burnt. He's the guy that later on is going to start the massacre of the Jewish people and the church. So when he says, I appeal to Caesar, he says, I'm going to the head man. That's what he's talking about. And you'll see the word later on this morning as we read through here. Augustus, I appeal to Augustus. He's appealing to the head man, which is Nero. He said, verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. Now, was Paul pointed? Was he plain? Was he right to the point? He said, Festus, you know I haven't hurt the Jews. He said, I came to Jerusalem to worship. I came to Jerusalem to pay tithes. I came to Jerusalem in peace, and I'd only been here less than 10 days and 12 days, and I had been arrested. Verse 11, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. He says, if I'm guilty, I'm ready to die. He said, but if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. Paul says the magic words, I appeal unto Caesar. He said, as we would say today, I'm going to the Supreme Court. I'm through with you local jokers. I don't like what's going on here. I appeal to Caesar. You see, Paul was a Roman citizen, and he was innocent until proven guilty. And he says, you haven't condemned me. There is not one person that has made a testimony against me. And he said, I'm going to take this out of your hands, Festus, and I'm going to take it to the top. Now, I want you to think with me. What is God's will in Paul's life? Well, in Paul's life, when he got saved, God told him, he says, I want you to be a witness to the Gentiles, right? And he said, you're going to preach to the Gentiles. You'll preach to the Jews, yes, but you're going to preach to the kings and to the top people. So when Paul comes on the scene, there's a lot of people that will say, well, Paul jumped the gun here. No, I don't think so. Because you see, verse 12, then Festus, when he had conferred with the council. In other words, Festus turned to his lawyers and said, what are we going to do? He wants to take this all the way to the top. Now, Festus has a problem. What's he going to put in the charges against Paul? What's he going to tell Nero that Paul is guilty of what he's done? Festus is kind of in a really tight spot. So he turns to his legal counsel and says, what shall we do? He turns back around and he said to Paul, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Now think with me. Paul, you got to go to Rome. You appeal to Caesar, you're out of my jurisdiction now. The Jews this way are not going to be offended by Festus. It's out of Festus' hands, and God is going to take control here. God's had a purpose for Paul going to Rome, and what was that purpose? What was the purpose for Paul going to Rome? Talk to me.
Preach.
To preach, to witness, and to show the world what salvation was all about. Is it not interesting that they've had over 2 years, they have played with this case politically, and in one sentence, God overturns all of their messing around. God says he's going to Rome. Period. I mean, there's nothing they can do about it now. Well, it just so happens that when Festus has come to town, he's the new guy on the block, that the king is coming around and he's going to welcome him to the kingdom that he has. It says in verse 13, "And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute," or to visit, "Festus." He's come to visit Festus. Do you think Festus is going to talk to King Agrippa about this matter? Well, let me tell you a little bit about Agrippa and Bernice. Agrippa was known as Herod Agrippa II. He was a young man. He was 30 years old. His great-grandfather, do you know him? His great-grandfather was Herod the Great. The massacre of the innocents. What does that mean to you? That means he was the guy that killed all the babies at the time of Christ. That was his great-grandpa. His great-uncle, Herod Antipas, was the king that beheaded John the Baptist. Now, this is all his family. His father, King Agrippa the First, was the man that had executed James in Jerusalem, cut his head off. Now, if you put these things in order, you know here that Herod Agrippa the First, this Agrippa's dad, is going to die when he's 16 years old. His dad was in Jerusalem, and if you remember the story, after he executed James, the Jews elevated him and said, "Oh, it's the voice of a God." And he says, "Yeah, I am a God." You remember the story? The worms came and destroyed his dad, ate his guts out, and he died. This is the guy that has come to visit Festus. Did he know much about Judaism? You bet. Why did his grandfather kill all the babies? Because he was afraid of the king of the Jews. Each one of his predecessors had died and been disgraced as soon as he attacked the Lord's program. Each one of them had been linked to Jesus and to his resurrection. Each one of them knew about Jews and what was going on. In fact, Herod Agrippa was a Jew. He had married Bernice. What a dismal creature. You remember Drusilla from last Sunday? That is Bernice's sister. Does that give you a little bit of idea where we're going with this? She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa the First. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you Herod Agrippa and Bernice were brothers and sisters. Before the books of Acts had been written, This lady had married a man named Marcus in the Roman government. She left him and married her great uncle for position. Incest. She had 2 sons, and she was widowed by the time she was 48. She later marries Ptolemy, the king of Cilicia. That's where Paul was from. And in the end of her life, she was mistress to the man that destroys Jerusalem. His name is Titus. This woman lived a very, very sordid and wicked life. You see, Agrippa and Bernice knew Jewish law and Jewish custom. In fact, King Agrippa was the one that had control of the Jewish treasury in the temple, and he's the one that picked the high priest. Now, this guy's come to talk to Festus, and Festus says, this guy will probably be able to help me, tell me what to do. Verse 14, and when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. I have a man that's a leftover that Felix wouldn't deal with, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests, they'd changed chief priests. It was not Annas anymore. His name was Ishmael now, and he had been picked by Herod Agrippa. The chief priests and elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that which he is accused, have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Now, I give you just a little understanding. You go with me to verse 20. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. He's basically saying, Festus says, I don't know what to do with this guy. I don't understand what the Jews are out after. They want to kill him, he says, but I don't understand it. Going back to verse 17. Therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom, when the accuser stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstitions, that means religious dealings, of the one Jesus. Now listen, this is Festus talking. He said of Jesus, which was dead, the Romans had killed him, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, can I tell you something here? Paul had preached the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ to Festus. Now, what is the gospel?
The good news of the death, burial, and resurrection.
Paul had preached the way of salvation to Festus. And Festus is kind of in a fog. He says, I don't know what to do. These people want to kill him. They want to get rid of him. He's talking about things that is really hard for me to understand. And can I put it this way? I think Felix is saying the crux, the center of the whole situation here is this Jesus of Nazareth who's risen from the dead. I mean, Festus was right on the money, wasn't he? He knew what the active ingredient in all of this was, and that was that Paul was preaching the gospel. He said, Agrippa, you're really acquainted with Jewish customs and the law. Verse 20, we read, And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, that's Caesar, that's Nero, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. So right now, he's trying to get all of his prisoners that he's going to send to Rome to Caesar together, and he's going to send one boatload over, okay? And he says, I've been waiting. Verse 22, Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Do you remember when Herod said, I'd like to meet Christ. I'd like to see some of his miracles. Do you remember that? Well, it kind of runs in the family, doesn't it? This Herod Agrippa says, I'd like to listen to this man. I know I can't do judgment. But I'd like to hear him. And Festus said, Tomorrow, said he, shalt thou hear him. Now, I need to go back and give you a little geography right here. When Herod had built Caesarea, he had built an amphitheater. This amphitheater looked out over to the Mediterranean Sea. It would seat thousands and thousands of people. This is the bottom of it was below sea level. He had a canal built over. He would fill the base of this amphitheater with water, and he had put boats out there, and he'd play war games on the water. He had strings on the boats, and he'd have his navies and everything, and he'd play in this amphitheater. He also had built a theater. It's interesting that in you and I's lifetime, archaeologists have found the dedication stone for this auditorium, and guess who the procurator of Syria was? It was Pilate. And until they found that stone, they said Pilate was a figment of Christian imagination. When they found that temple, that auditorium that had been built and dedicated to Pontius Pilate, there's no question. There was really a Pontius Pilate. And that was the Pontius Pilate that said of Jesus Christ, I find no fault in him. That was the Pontius Pilate that washed his hands and tried to get the blood, the responsibility off his hands, and he couldn't. Agrippa says, I want to hear him. He said, okay, tomorrow we'll have a hearing. Now, we're going to see a real show. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, I want you to notice here, these women are always included with them, with great pomp. Now, what is great pomp? I mean, they put on the dog. They're going to have a big production here. They're going to have the guards. They're going to have well, we'll see who's going to be there. And verse 24, And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man. I was in 23. And on the morrow when Agrippa was come and Bernice with great pomp, and was entered into the palace of hearing with chief captains. Now this chief captains were the captains that were over the centurions. Do you see the level here? These men were over not 100, but they were over thousands. And these cohorts, there was, Josephus tells us there was 5 cohorts, so that means there was over 50,000 soldiers under the command of these chief captains and principal men of the city. At Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. Okay, here comes King Agrippa. He has his purple robes on. He has his golden crown on. He has his scepter. And he has men carrying the train of his robe as he comes in. Beside him is Bernice. She has her crown and her jewels and her diamonds and all of her stunning paraphernalia. They're putting on a show. They called it pomp. And I mean, it was the big show of the day. All of the political figures in Caesarea was there to see the show. And at Festus' command, Paul was brought forth. Now, I want you to make a comparison. You have this king with his crown and all of this power and all of these soldiers, and you have Bernice and all of her jewelry and everything else on, and now you have Paul in his prison clothes in shackles and chains. What a comparison. And as they're there, it says, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. He needs to die. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, stop. What was Festus' judgment? He was innocent. He wasn't guilty of anything. He said, he's not worthy of death. And that he himself hath appeared to Augustus, have I determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. He said, what am I going to write to Nero? What am I going to tell him? I don't think this guy's guilty. Why am I sending him? I'll tell you why, because God said Paul was going to go to Rome. God told Paul he was going to preach to kings and princes and that he was going to preach to the Gentiles throughout the world. That's why poor Festus, he didn't have a clue. God did. And he's telling Agrippa, he says, what am I going to tell? What am I going to tell Caesar? What am I going to tell him? Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. He said, you're the master in Jewish law and customs. You deal with these people. You're going to have to tell me what to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. I find him not worthy of death in any way. I want you to go with me, save your place here, go with me to Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 15, Paul is talking to Ananias, and I'm sure Ananias is going to tell Paul, but the Lord said unto me, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles. Just a minute, did Festus and Felix know the name of Christ now? Yeah. Is Nero going to know the name of Christ now? Yeah. He said, I have called Paul to be the one that will bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel, for I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. Was it a surprise to Paul that he was in this position? I think Paul said, let's get the show on the road. I'm sick and tired of sitting in jail here, and I don't have anything to tell the king about. I have nothing. Paul said, this is what God had ordered. Go with me to chapter 23 here in the book of Acts. And in chapter 23 and verse 11, Paul is in jail, Jerusalem, bad shape. It says, "In the night following, the Lord, Jesus Christ, stood by him." The Lord came to Paul and he said, "Paul, be of good cheer. For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." Was Paul out of God's will? Not for a minute. Paul had been preaching the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. He had been faithful in proclaiming that there's only one way to heaven, and that is Jesus Christ. Now we have probably the biggest production, the most costly array, and Paul is ready to go give a defense again. We're not going to do it in chapter 26. This is Paul's longest and probably greatest sermon. The Bible records it. And I mean to tell you, it's full force. He gives it everything he's got. And he gives his salvation, the Lord's call to the ministry, and what he's doing. And he said, "I'm going to Rome, and I'm going to tell Nero. I'm going to tell him about the Lord Jesus Christ." Now, was Paul being faithful? Guess what? Paul had an all-expense-paid trip to Rome. One way. He's going to go there, and he's going to get to proclaim Jesus Christ. You know, Festus says, he's not worthy of death. He's been faithful. And he said, "It appears to me the whole problem rests upon this man, Jesus Christ, his death, his burial, and his resurrection." And you know something? Festus was right on the money. Even today, you must answer the question, who is Jesus? Is he the King of Kings? Is he the one that came to this earth and paid for salvation, paid for your sins? The question then is, what have you done with Jesus Christ? Have you rejected him or have you accepted him? Today's the day. Now's the time. Would you trust him? Mark?